Welcome everyone. My name's Catherine and I'm filling in for Christy, who many of you who are regular Talking History participants will recognise, but she's lost her voice, and so very last minute we're changing things for this program. So I'll be introducing our speakers tonight and then they're going to take over. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we at the History Trust are broadcasting from the land of the Kaurna people, and Ianto Ware, our keynote speaker, is joining us from the land of the Gadigal people. So some people have already been telling us in the chat where they're joining us from, whose land that they're watching from. But we'd like to acknowledge the primary place of Aboriginal people in the history of Australia, both here in South Australia on Kaurna land, where we're broadcasting from, and all around Australia. We acknowledge that our story here commenced long before Governor Hindmarsh proclaimed the new province of South Australia and established the colonial government in 1836, and that Aboriginal people have a long history that extends millennia into the past. We acknowledge that Aboriginal land and sovereignty were not recognised, and that building a shared understanding of our history is crucial to reconciliation and to creating a positive future for us all here in South Australia and more broadly around Australia. So for those of you who haven't joined a Talking History before, it's pretty much the standard format that you will have seen on other webinars if you've joined in anything since COVID started and we all jumped on Zoom. We're not going to warn you about your toilets and emergency exits. We hope you know where they are, but make yourself comfortable because we're going to be here for a little while together and have the refreshments handy. You will, if you're attending tonight, be muted. It's only our speakers and our hosts that have the potential to jump on the audio. So if you want to participate, there's already some conversation going on in the chat, and myself and Christy and Karen will be keeping an eye on that while the speakers are talking. And there's also a Q&A function, which is separate to the chat. So if you have a question that you want us to ask when Nikki and Ianto have finished asking each other questions, you can jump in with your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar, and then I'll read them out to our speakers at the end on your behalf. So if you forget and put it in the chat, don't worry, we'll be keeping an eye on that as well. But if you put your questions in the Q&A, then they can go up to the top and we'll have no problem finding them at the end. It also gives other participants the opportunity to give your question a thumbs up and vote on it, and the popular ones will float to the top, which makes it easy to find them, so you can have a bit of a running commentary there as well. I'd also like to remind everyone before we get started with our speakers that we are recording tonight. So that is the audio and the visual that you're seeing. It's not the chat and the conversation, so don't worry about that. We'll see a record of it, but that won't be on the recording that goes up online later. So all that remains for me is to introduce our wonderful speakers. It's going to be a really fabulous session tonight, I think. It's an illuminating conversation with Dr. Ianto Ware, author of Mother and I, The Willful Family, 2021, and Dr. Nikki Sullivan, who has recently, sadly, left us at the History Trust. So some of you may remember her from her time here, and I'll get to her bio in a minute. But she and Ianto will be talking about the personal and political history of feminism, lesbianism, gender, class and motherhood in 1970s and 80s suburban Adelaide, which is within our living memory. It always scares me when history is within my lifetime. Ianto's book Mother and I is a celebration of the life and character of his mother Dimity Ware, who in the wake of the Dunstan era fell in love with a woman, left her husband and became a single parent, feminist and radical gardener. I want to hear more about that. It's part memoir, part history and part homage to suburban eccentricity. Tonight's event is going to be a little different, as I already flagged. Nikki and Ianto will be interviewing each other instead of doing a talk, as we sometimes have with slideshows and things. So it will be much more of a conversation tonight than some of our speeches have been. So to introduce Ianto to you properly, and I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly now, Ianto, so please do jump in if I'm not.
Yes, you are. You're doing very well.
Thank you. I had to have coaching from Nikki. Ianto is a former zine publisher, a civil servant, and the author of 21 Nights in July, a personal history of the Tour de France from 2014, and his most recent publication, which we're talking about tonight, Her Mother and I, the history of a willful family. They're both available through Hunter Publishers. So previously, Ianto was the author of 2 long-running zines and the founding director of Adelaide's Format Festival, producer of the Festival of Unpopular Culture, CEO of Renew Adelaide, and co-director of the National Live Music Office. He's currently working in the research team at the City of Sydney and is an honorary associate at the University of Sydney's Department of Gender and Cultural Studies. So huge CV there. Ianto was born in Adelaide, but now lives in Sydney with his wife and the artist, his wife, the artist, Diana Baker. That was a faux pas, but Diana Baker Smith, sorry, and their 2 cats, Judith and Adrienne. Now, Ianto, I will introduce Nikki first and then let the 2 of you get into your questions. So Nikki, as I said, was Dr. Nikki Sullivan, was recently the manager of the Centre of Democracy, and unfortunately we've lost her from that position. But Nikki's love of history and all things queer has been central to her academic work and to that position and others that she held at the History Trust of South Australia at both the Migration Museum and the Centre of Democracy. And currently the pilot project that she's working on and coordinating is at Samesh. Nikki is no stranger to many of you in the audience. I'm sure lots of you will have been familiar with her work through her academic work and the critical and cultural studies to queer politics that she's been involved in. And she's passionately made the museum sector more inclusive and representative to all areas of our society. So, as well as now piloting a fascinating and life-changing project here with Samesh in Adelaide, and Nikki, I might get you to explain that a little bit more later when we chat. Nikki's also adjunct associate professor in the School of Humanities, Faculty of Arts, University of Adelaide, and she recently co-authored Queering the Museum with her friend and colleague Craig Middleton, who's working now at the National Museum of Australia. So I think that's enough talking from me after having mangled those bios. Our usual host, Christy, unfortunately, as I said, I can't speak very well tonight. She usually does a much better job of that, but I'll hand over, and I think, Nikki, you're kicking off the questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here and to be here and in conversation with Ianto Ware about Mother and I, which is an absolutely brilliant book, which if you haven't read it, please do. I would like to also acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Ghana land, and as well as paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, to pay my gratitude, I guess, for the privilege of being able to live on this wonderful country. So Ianto, your book, Mother and I, The History of a Willful Family, is many things, as Catherine was saying. It's a memoir, a slice of social history, a reflection on aspects of life that we often take for granted. But perhaps most of all, it's the celebration of the life and the character of your mother, Dimity Ware. So I'd like to begin by asking you if you might provide a brief overview of the period 1972 to 1980, which is the time in which your mother made a series of really significant and life-changing decisions.
Yeah, so my mother in 1972 was at Bedford Teachers College. When she started there, one of her lecturers told her that she was quite unique, because the lecturer said that you were one of the first girls from a working class background I've seen come into higher education or into college. So she and my aunt both went to college. My aunt became a librarian, my mother became a teacher. While she was there, she had a couple of things happen. So one of them was that she met my father, who she married at the end of that year, I think, because she thought marriage was kind of compulsory and that's just what you had to do to become an adult. He was quite a nice boy, but yeah, it was something she did because she thought it was an obligation. Simultaneously, she encountered feminism and women's libs. So she had taken on a part-time job as a babysitter. The person that she was babysitting for subscribed to the Women's Electoral Lobby newsletter. I think at some point she'd met Deborah McCulloch, who I was sorry to see had passed away recently. Through the Women's Electoral Lobby, she started going to reading groups. I think she'd read, Adrienne Rich and Sheila Rowbotham and that sort of that kind of wave of feminist theory. She also met lesbians for the first time, which she thought was pretty cool, and she got quite enthusiastic about that, but still didn't really, she still thought she had to get married, settle down, have kids, have a stable job. In 1974, I think she'd started teaching. That was, I think, also the year Paulo Freire came to Australia. I think that the educational theorist, a sort of socialist educational theorist, and she got really interested in critical literacy and started teaching at mostly working class and sort of quite low socioeconomic schools. And I think sort of came into this kind of socialist feminist realization and started approaching the world in a very political way. My grandparents, I think, had probably informed that quite a bit. They had a very active interest in history, sort of a political understanding of the world, if not an active political kind of set of behaviors, but they were very supportive of her doing that. So she'd had this sort of realization, and then in 1976, her kidney collapsed. So she was born in 1952, grew up in Belair. At that point, Belair and the Adelaide Hills had only just been rezoned for housing, so the water supply wasn't very good. We think that's why she had kidney failure. So that was, I think, the point where, I think it was Gough Whitlam said that Australia was the most effluent nation in the world because the housing supply had outstripped the infrastructure for water and sewage. So she'd always had this problem with her kidneys, had quite experimental surgery when she was about 11 to try and stop them dying. And then they collapsed completely in 1976. At that point, organ transplants were pretty new and pretty dangerous. So there was 2 other people that had organ transplants at the same time. One of them died of pneumonia 2 weeks later. The other one was a woman who she knew quite well, and she could hear this woman dying in the other room and kind of crying and begging for help. And when my mother survived the transplant, her doctor said, well, you've probably got 10 years. And she sort of left the hospital and thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life living this life that I feel like I have to live out of a sense of conformity. She had her first affair with a woman shortly after that, stayed married for a while. They tried to have a sort of 1970s style open marriage. She had a miscarriage shortly after that, which she blamed on the medication she was taking for her transplanted organ. She decided after that she couldn't even pretend to be heterosexual anymore, decided to leave my father in 1979, left him. About 3 weeks after she left him, realized she was pregnant with me. Her doctors told her, if you have a kid, you'll die, but she sort of ignored them and did it anyway. I think she sort of saw it almost like an immaculate conception, like she had come to this she defeated death, she'd overcome this kidney transplant, she had overcome the force of convention and set out on her own, and then been rewarded with this child. And then I was born in 1980, which is, I think the first IVF baby was only a couple of months before me. There were no gabies at that time. There was no other families like me that I remember meeting. When I was writing the book, I kind of realized that I've never met anyone from a queer family who is older than me. I know they're out there, but I've never met anybody from that had that experience. So we were quite unusual, I think, for our time. And I think we also sat at this weird point between my mother growing up in having these realizations at a period where it seemed like there was a more progressive politics occurring and a more progressive culture that was a bit less bigoted and closed-minded. And then I was born and the Reagan era kicked in and the Thatcher era kicked in, and things grew progressively more kind of hostile. And I remember a lot growing up, hearing that kind of rhetoric about broken homes and welfare queens and the kind of perception that homosexuality was akin to pedophilia, and sort of being stuck between these two kind of historical epochs, which I think leads on to the second question Christy was going to ask, Nikki, if you can give us a bit of the historical context for that era.
Yeah. So I think, as I was reading the book, I guess I kept thinking about, what had been happening such that Ianto's mother, along with most of the other women of her age, kind of just sort of fell into marriage as the thing that you do. What were the sort of norms of the time? Well, we know that everybody has heard of the sort of the radical 60s when things were sort of changing internationally. and South Australia was no exception to that. But I want to think, I guess, a little bit before that. So in 1965, if I'm right, Ianto, your mum became a teenager. And at that time, there was a state election in which the incumbent Liberal and Country League, led by Premier Thomas Playford, South Australia's longest premier, and the party had at that stage been in power for 32 years, was defeated by the Australian Labor Party. Frank Walsh became premier, but only held that position for a couple of years and was replaced by Don Dunstan. So what we have is this kind of really massive and significant change in political power in South Australia, which did reflect changes that were happening elsewhere. At the next election in 1968, Labor lost, despite having won about 53%, I think it was, of the two-party vote. But they did regain power in 1970, and they maintained that position for 9 years. And we often speak of that period as the Dunstan Decade, as, you know, as South Australia's most kind of radical decade, if you like. But I think the important thing to remember is that it came in the wake of a very sort of stable liberal period which followed World War II. So there's all sorts of things happening internationally, nationally, and in South Australia. What happens here when the Dunstan government gets in is that there's massive social change, which most of us hold up as being, you know, iconic in terms of social progress. So that administration saw things like Aboriginal land rights recognised, homosexuality decriminalised, anti-discrimination laws introduced. It saw the appointment of the first female judge, the first non-British governor, the first Indigenous governor. Health and social welfare systems were reformed and expanded. The public service was almost doubled. The death penalty was abolished. Censorship laws were relaxed, as were drinking laws. So, you know, the 6 o'clock closing was lifted. The voting age was lowered. Police autonomy and powers were restricted, in particular after the 1970 September moratorium and the events that happened around that. And of course, the dress code for Parliament was relaxed, hence the fabulous pink shorts that we all love so dearly and that are in the centre of democracy. The Dunstan government also promoted multiculturalism. This became a kind of a concept, I guess, that prior to that had really been quite, well, not spoken of, certainly not spoken of in those terms. And in fact, the White Australia policy had been the kind of dominant way of thinking prior to this. That government also promoted heritage preservation, South Australian viticulture, and I think really significantly for people like us, increased funding for the arts sevenfold. At the same time that those sorts of parliamentary changes were happening, South Australians were protesting against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. And the September 1970 moratorium saw the largest number of protesters ever gathered in Adelaide to date. And in fact, that's only ever been superseded by once by the 2003 anti-war rally. That same year, there was Women's Liberation held their first demonstration at Adelaide University in response to the Miss Fresher competition. And really, I guess that was a critique of the objectification of women more generally. And then the following year, and I thought this was kind of really interesting with regard to this discussion of motherhood, in 1971, the Adelaide Women's Liberation Group distributed what they called a Mother's Day card, but instead of resembling what we would ordinarily think of as a Mother's Day card, it called for maternity leave, an end to job discrimination, childcare, abortion, and a critique of the low status of mothers. It didn't, of course, get any media coverage, but I guess what Ianto's story illustrates, and the lives of so many women I know illustrates, is that if you were receptive to that message, it reached you. I guess I'm reminded sort of through the questions that Ianto and I have asked each other and responded to so far of a revelation which Ianto recounts in the book of a point in his life when he was reading Down and Out in Paris and London. And you realize, Ianto, that we're all bound up, I guess, in these great tides of history. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about this, particularly because this is a History of Trust event. If you might reflect a little bit on history, what you think is the import of history, and yeah, tell us in what sense this is a contribution to history.
Yeah, so I had this point when I was maybe 15, 16, where my mother decided I was becoming too patriarchal, which I was. I was, you know, going to high school and hang out with high school boys in a kind of not great school, and felt that the society that I saw within there was kind of unavoidable. And I think there was a certain way of looking at the world that had occurred around that point. So this is kind of, you know, I sort of grew up in that era where, you know, Francis Fukuyama had that essay about it's the end of history and this is just how it is now. So after the Berlin Wall had fallen, there's going to be no more revolutions. It's just how it is. And I remember being like kind of, yeah, probably 14 and climbing up on the roof of our house, probably after having an argument with my mother, and looking out over the suburb and just thinking, well, this is it. This is the whole world. There's no, my mother can live in this beautiful lesbian utopia, but I have to go out into the world of men, and the world of men seemed pretty horrible. And I couldn't kind of get any context of it. It just seemed unavoidable. And I mean, she'd sort of, you know, she talked about the personal being political before, but it seemed like that was fine for her, but I was living in a different world. And, you know, probably like a lot of the people that are in my age group, the version of history I grew up with or was taught at school, particularly after the bicentennial, it was that kind of classic, you know, Captain Cook came to Australia because he heard there was great property investments, and then Captain Phillip unleashed those property investments, and then the Muslims threatened negative gearing, so he went to Gallipoli to defend it, and now everything's great and stop complaining. And that didn't really give me a lot of context to understand why I was so miserable and frustrated living in this suburb and feeling pretty, yeah, contained. So my mother snapped, took me to Westlake's library, borrowed all of the George Orwell books. I have no idea why she picked George Orwell, but I think I read, you know, probably half a dozen of them over the course of the summer. So, you know, Animal Farm in 1984, read Homage to Catalonia. I had no idea there had been this Spanish Civil War in Spain, and there'd been this kind of movements between fascism and kind of anarchists, and you know, I found that absolutely amazing. And then read Down and Out in Paris and London. And I think it was really indicative of that sense of the personal being political, that you could see somebody who had embedded themselves in their writing, but was talking about socioeconomics and things that I now take for granted, like, you know, political economy, and you know, a different way of understanding history is something you have to interrogate compared to the mythology I'd just grown up with. But I think my mother was looking for a tactic that would help me have some of the same revelations that she had, that she'd got out of reading, you know, Sheila Rowbotham when she was 20, which I think was a big part of the political movement that she was involved with at that time, which I think is where I hand back to you, Nikki, if you can sort of talk us through some of the politics around second wave feminism and mothering that maybe it helped her reach those realizations ahead of me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was interested then, Ianto, by the fact that a couple of times you mentioned that phrase, the personal is political, a phrase, I guess, which many of you listening will be familiar with, and which for me really just characterizes second wave feminism. That it really was an incredible insight that the personal is political. Prior to this point, really, you know, that there had been this separation of public and private, personal and political, and the assumption was that women and all of the things that women dealt with, like, you know, looking after babies, were just belonged in the private realm. They were personal things. They had nothing to do with politics. They were just kind of natural. And I guess what feminism did was to say, look, you know, in an era when motherhood and is seen as women's natural vocation, when women marry because that's the kind of default position, when they can't achieve equal pay with men, and therefore are financially dependent, all of these things that are related to these particular, the very specific gender roles that are associated with heterosexual marriage and with motherhood, all of these things are central to women's oppression. They might not be the things that are being talked about in Parliament. They might not be the things that are being regarded as, you know, political or as politics, but in fact, they are the politics of everyday life, because these are the means through which women's oppression is continued, I suppose. So at in this period, you had lots of women doing things like arguing for the recognition that housework was unpaid labor, for example, for the recognition that heterosexuality is not just something that happens naturally, it is in fact an institution, and an institution that is shaped by cultural norms that are not inevitable, that are actually open to question and to change. I think also what was really important then was that this idea that, you know, you could question these things because they weren't just natural, they were political, and that in questioning them, you could actually argue for legislative change, for economic change, for social change, which would impact individual women and would impact the state, if you like. I think throughout your book, Ianto, you mention an incredible and really influential landmark book by the American feminist Adrienne Rich, which was published in 1976, called Of Woman Born, Motherhood as Experience and Institution. And what Rich was arguing there was that, you know, motherhood is not a natural apolitical state. It's not something that just happens to us. It's something that's always shaped and experienced in culturally specific ways. And her argument, and the argument of most feminists in this period, was that motherhood is an ideological construct, and it's a patriarchal one, at least as it was being lived by women in the West at that point. And it's a role that supports and is supported by a whole raft of inequitable relations of power. So I guess the question was, what do you do in response to that then? So there were some feminists who sort of rejected motherhood altogether, and Dimity obviously felt the sort of brunt of that from some of her feminist sisters, you might say. There were also feminists like Shulamith Firestone who called for the technologization of reproduction so that men could have babies as well, and it wouldn't, you know, you could then have a different division of labor. But I think for the most part, many feminists were actually doing the hard work of fighting for equal pay, childcare, maternity leave, flexible work schedules, access to abortion and contraception. And all of these things were really central to the second wave feminist agenda. All of these things, all of these struggles were struggles to recognize that the personal is political. So I guess, you know, having said that, set up that kind of political backdrop, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more, Ianto, about how you think feminist thinking about motherhood impacted both Dimity's life, but also your own, particularly as the son of a feminist. So there's a lot of feminists who are writing about, you know, this relationship between feminist mothers and daughters, but you were the son of a feminist.
Yeah. I mean, Adrienne Rich, I think, had sons as well and writes really beautifully about them. There's a wonderful essay by Audre Lorde where she talks about her relationship to her son, which is probably one of the earliest and one of the few essays where I've read of somebody who maybe had an experience comparable to my mother about what it was like. I think for what she got out of a lot of the feminist theory at the time, probably the same as what a lot of people got out of it. It was a bit of a protection against just the sheer hostility that they were receiving, because the critique of single mothers and queer mothers, queers in general, it was pretty profound. And I don't know many people who came out in that time who haven't had some sort of that kind of psychological damage of being in a society where you're just getting constantly attacked. So I think it gave her some tactics to do with that. I think there was some issues she had around, she had clashes with the old sort of separatists, because she had a male child, and I think she found that really upsetting. I look back at it and can see, well, if you've got people who are at the front wave of fighting for gender equality and rethinking what it would mean to be a person kind of outside of or in opposition to patriarchy, you can see how that would put that kind of pressure on people. But she felt, I think, initially quite upset about it. In later life, she went, she stayed friends with a lot of those people, and they were a great support to her right up until her death. But I think a lot of the feminist theory gave her a way of thinking through what was happening to her. It gave her a methodology. She went back to went back to college in the late 80s, and that was when you still, she was doing a grad dip in teaching, but you still got a bit of that more sort of creative education for the sake of education. So she did a women's writing class where I think she read Adrienne Rich's Politics of Location. So she was still getting this kind of feminist force to help her think about how she wanted to live and how she wanted to be a mother. For me, I often hear people talk about, growing up in a single parent family or growing up around sort of queer identity is going to be hostile and it's going to somehow destroy your life, particularly if you're a boy. For me, growing up in that way was absolutely wonderful. We had a really, really good relationship. I think I was allowed to do a lot of things other boys weren't allowed to do. I didn't have to perform this kind of mimic of masculinity I think a lot of guys grow up with. I think it's also just really nice to grow up thinking patriarchy is kind of optional, that you don't have to do it. I think a lot of the men I've met since then, they grow up with this quite Hegelian way of viewing the world as something they have to defeat, and viewing women in particular as something they always have to be kind of defeating or in conflict with. It's nice not to grow up with that politics. I remember the point where I started really encountering and thinking, oh, this is unavoidable. And just how, aside from it being upsetting, just how weird it is, just how strange it is to have a culture that thinks like that. But if you're around it every day or you grow up with it, you can't necessarily see how bizarre it is. The negative was that when I left our house and left, the relationship, just me and my mother at home together, I did have to engage with that world, and that was pretty rough. I think as a child, growing up, and you'd hear people like Fred Nile or Bob Santamaria on the radio or television talking about how single mothers were going to be the destruction of all society, and how homosexual people were pedophiles who spread AIDS, and that children like me should be taken away from their children, from their mothers. And that attitude, I still hear people say that. There's a quote in the book from Margaret Thatcher that children from single parent mothers should be taken away from their families. She made that comment in 1998, which was the year that I became an adult. And I still hear that occasionally. Now I'm a 41-year-old middle-class man with a great job living in Potts Point, economically stable, married. I hear those critiques and I kind of laugh at them, but to grow up being told that your mother is a pedophile and you are going to become a degenerate and you should be taken away forcibly, when you're 9 or 10, that is really upsetting and very, very difficult to deal with. I think there's kind of maybe a bit of I think there seems like there's points where there's been changes in law that have maybe made it easier to be gay or have a different family, but then there's also this cultural clash against it. But I'm interested, Nikki, to sort of go back to you and get some of that sort of legal context. I know when my mother got married, she kind of thought it was compulsory, and homosexuality was still illegal at that point. Can you sort of talk us through a bit of some of the legal stuff of how it changed and when?
Yeah. So your mum and dad got married in October 1972, and as you say, homosexuality was actually illegal in South Australia at that point. But just prior to their marriage, in May that same year, there had been a tragic event that took place in Adelaide that did, or at least was one of the sort of factors, I guess, that contributed to law reform here. So some of you might be familiar with this story, but basically on May the 10th, 1972, a young law lecturer who'd recently arrived from the UK called Dr. George Duncan was walking along the River Torrens in the city along a cruising area, what was quite well known to be a cruising area, and a car pulled up and 3 men got out and threw him and 2 other men into the River Torrens. And unfortunately, Duncan was not able to swim, and while the other men managed to get out, he didn't, he drowned. And when this came to light, and the fact that he was a newly arrived law lecturer, and that this idea that the guys responsible for throwing these men in were in fact police officers, there was sort of public outcry. And so there was much discussion in the news media and elsewhere about attitudes to homosexuality and about police corruption. It's a long and complicated story, but basically what it led to was that same year, a member of parliament called Murray Hill tabled a bill in the state's legislative council to decriminalise homosexual activity between men. And while it passed, what actually did pass was an amended version that really, I guess, destroyed its intent. But a second decriminalisation bill was passed in 1975, and that was the first such act in Australia to decriminalise sex between men, which is interesting because, in fact, you know, your mum obviously was never subject to that law in the same way that men were. But I guess, you know, there's much to celebrate about the decriminalisation of homosexuality and South Australia's role as a first. And we very often do that. But I guess what really struck me reading your book and thinking more deeply was that decriminalisation doesn't actually get rid of homophobia. And in fact, you know, it's still everywhere around us. The fact that the 3 vice squad officers we know were responsible for Duncan's murder were never charged illustrates that, but as do many of the stories in your book. So you talk about how when you were born, the idea of producing a child, a lesbian producing a child, was unthinkable. That, of course, at that time, gays and lesbians were not allowed to adopt children even. And in fact, that didn't change for another 36 years. So it was as recent as 2016 that the Adoption Review Amendment Bill was passed, which meant that gays and lesbians are now able to adopt children. But you also recount lots of tales of your own encounters, I guess, with homophobia, and the way in which your failure or your refusal to perform hegemonic masculinity made you, and I use this word in the derogatory way that it was used against you, made you a fag in the eyes of those who were desperate to shore up their sort of patriarchal privilege. So you talk about things like, you know, your My Little Pony. You couldn't have a My Little Pony as a boy without being called gay, and not even just being called gay. I mean, it was much more abusive than that. But I really like that whilst at the same time that you talk about those incidents, you kind of celebrate, I guess, and you were talking about this just now, the possibility that you were given to recognize that there were other ways to be a man, that there were other ways to live beyond the sort of macho caricatures that our culture offers us. So, you know, your mother gave you other ways to think, but through that, you were also introduced to feminist writers like Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, who gave you a way to think about these other possibilities as things to celebrate. And of course, in your book, things to document. So how did the mainstream ideas about sexuality impact you and Dimity? Could you just give us a couple of examples?
I mean, I really felt them when I went to high school, and to fit in with the other boys, you kind of had to adopt that kind of extremely harsh patriarchal way of behavior. And you can't adopt that behavior, at least in my case, without effectively forsaking your mother and your family. And especially, I think, having a family that was just two of us, it was a very extreme, it wasn't something I wanted to do. It's something I felt like I had to do. And I remember at sort of 14, 15, thinking, almost being kind of angry with her because she couldn't protect me from it, which I think is probably one of the first points of being inducted into kind of patriarchal culture, where you're actively encouraged to blame your mother for everything, and sort of not think more deeply about what's going on or look at the context of it. The upside is, I think, because she had brought me up with that way of critical thinking, eventually it did sort of kick in. The Audre Lorde essay on her son talks about raising sons. She says it's harder than raising girls, because your daughters will have you as, I think she says, as model. They'll either move away from it or reject it, but they've always got this kind of model of what it means to be a feminist woman. And she says your sons will have to take whatever you can give them and then reforge it in their own image. And it did kind of feel like that as I kind of grew up, having to take the tools she'd given me and find new ways of using them and applying them differently. The tools, I think, were fantastic. I always have this issue with all the kind of men's rights critique of feminist theory, because I've just found it so useful. I find almost nothing in feminist theory to be in any way hostile to men. I think it's the same as my mother. Its focus is on patriarchy. Its focus is on a culture that is hostile and aggressive. And I find it frustrating that a lot of men, haven't had an exposure to that kind of way of thinking, and then will get stuck in this cycle of not thinking about the context they're operating in and just reverting back to blaming somebody else over and over again. But yeah, I don't know if that's so much a sexuality issue thing as it's about a patriarchy thing, and a very sort of strong sense of things being homogenous and you having to be homogenous. And that, again, a kind of a Thatcherite thing of like, there is no other option. This is just how the world is. This is how you need to be.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to, I think it's hard for me to tell, because I haven't just sort of stopped being, I'm still the son of a single lesbian working class mother, but I've become a heterosexual married middle class man. It's hard for me to tell whether the things that affected her, if she was having that experience now, would be the same, whether she would still be unable to be out at work, whether, I didn't start telling friends of mine that I had a lesbian mother till I was in my 20s, because I was worried for the repercussions. Some of those things maybe have changed over time. Some of them, I think about if she'd had me in 2000 or 2010 or 2020, depending on where she was living. She had things like, she didn't have a massive HECS debt, the student debt. She'd been able to buy a house when she was in her 20s on a single income. Not a great house, not a great neighborhood, but she could get stability. She had stable work. There was a sort of economic base that she could fall back on that gave her a bit of agency over her life. I think one of the things that came in the 80s and 90s was it's almost a reversion to a kind of a poor law attitude that if you're a single mother, that is a moral failure on your part. Your economic issues are a moral failure. And I think we saw the same thing in the debates around HIV, this attitude that you have got this disease because you are morally failed. And that legacy is still very much with us in the way we approach socioeconomics and the way we approach health. I'm still regularly appalled at the attitudes to single mothers. I don't think the issue is sexuality. I think it's a certain approach to capitalist patriarchy that I'm on the other side of it now. I don't experience it so viciously and directly, but it's still very much there.
Thank you. Now, I just want to ask you one quick question, and maybe you can just give us a little taster here, and then people will have to buy the book to find out more, because I want to give other people a opportunity to ask you some questions. But throughout the book, you compare Dimity's life as a willful act of nonconformity with radical gardening. Can you just tell us a little bit about radical gardening, but not too much?
So she loved gardening, and then when she got this house in the suburbs and it was surrounded by 1/4 acre blocks with lawns and people who are really obsessed with their lawns, she ripped up all of the lawn and planted quite a dense jungle. There's a bit in the book where I recall going back to Adelaide when I was living in Sydney in the plane banking, I could see this just explosion of green. Like she had 3 oak trees in the front yard that were probably 4 times taller than the house. Partly that was just she loved gardening. Partly I think she liked the idea of doing this thing that was kind of set herself apart from her neighbours and reminded them that the world didn't have to be so cut and dry. And I think it also kind of gave us a sense of safety. It's like, I mean, the house it's gone now, it's been bulldozed. I've tried to find out what's happened to it. I want to think it's still there, but I kind of imagine it's a bit like, you know, like she built that sort of Isle of Avalon where King Arthur went back to after he died, like this kind of mystical, safe isle where we have our own sort of myths and our own way of thinking, and it's all, yeah, all wonderful. Yeah.
Beautiful. You've got to find out more about radical gardening and the whole. I will say no more about the whole. That's great too. So I'm going to hand you back to Catherine now, and she's going to.
You're allowed to keep talking about radical gardening if you want to. Christy had actually just sent me a message saying, remember to make sure they explain the radical gardening. So she was keen to hear about it as well, as I'm sure many people were after the intro. But we have had some other questions from participants. So the first one I'll get to is from Janet, who's a regular on our Talking Histories and also has some connections to the History Trust. So she asks, Ianto and Nikki, what were the most joyous and exhilarating moments in these campaigns? Ianto, were you around the house when Dimity and her friends were having their meetings, deciding on their campaign strategies, making posters, those sorts of things? And she's saying that in her experience, the challenge to the patriarchal churches, which is an area Janet was active in, there was excitement and great fun in discovering their own creativity, and the wit went a long way to dealing with the angst. So perhaps if you can explore whether your experiences were similar or different or something else altogether.
I
suspect quite different. Nikki, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can, except to say that I'm a little bit younger than Dimity, and so not a whole lot, but my experience of feminism came, I guess, a little bit later. But one of the things I so loved about the book was, reading about how you'd go away to the women's camps, and there's always a bit of tension. On the one hand, there was this kind of sense of sisterhood and, this sort of space and intellectual space to discuss ideas. But at the same time, they annoyed each other. As people do. And so I loved the realness about the book, and it really reminded me of many, many of my own experiences, even though they may have happened a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, I was too young to remember the stuff in the 70s. I do remember going to a lot of the events in the early 80s. I think maybe people forget that a lot of that early feminist stuff was also heavily bound up in the contemporary art scene and had this very strong kind of cultural identity. So I remember going to events at University O Balls, and there's pictures of me running around, usually wearing very little clothing at like experimental art performances. Apparently there's a video of me running around in some archive for the Experimental Art Foundation as a sort of 1-year-old. When we moved to the suburbs, I think my mother lost a lot of those networks in between having to work full time and being quite isolated. She rejoined them when she got older and when she retired, and she was growing quite ill by that point. But when the plebiscite went through, her friends came and gathered her up in her wheelchair and took her to the Wheatsheaf Hotel to celebrate. And they were all, very happy this thing had happened. And I think she was quite upset, quite sort of overwhelmed by it. And then one of them asked, so is anyone here intending to get married? And none of them were. They were still true to their kind of marriage as a patriarchal institution, but they were glad that there was this sense that their unions were finally recognised by the state. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad to hear you're preserved for history somewhere as well, Ianto. It's always good to get yourself in an archive. So we have an anonymous comment and question from someone who's thanking you, Ianto, first of all, for sharing your family with everyone. And the comment says that this person is a parent of a young queer teen, and asks, what do you think your mum's story can tell someone just coming to terms with their sexuality now? What advice do you think your mum would give her?
Probably not to take advice from middle-aged heterosexual men would be the first one, because we don't know. But I think some of the things that she gave me to try and think about who I wanted to become, one of them is, I think, is it's a process. You know, being a person is sort of it's more of a methodology than reaching a final point and going out. And you know, my mother was very good at learning and reading and thinking and talking to other people and trying to think about how she fit into the world. I think it's a correlating factor to that. She really encouraged me to get an education in the humanities. So she encouraged me to do things like study English, and I did cultural studies and history, because I think some of those things give you a context that lets you figure out who you want to be and gives you a way of fending off some of the other ideas that tell you there is a single person you need to be, or you have to behave in a certain way. I guess the only one I would kind of put in there from my own experience is that I remember being, in my teens and just feeling that everything was pretty horrible and it was incredibly overwhelming. And I think if you have good family support around you, if you're lucky enough to have a parent supporting you, you will get over that time. You will get through it. And you will find other people who will help you get through it and help explain different things. You just need to remember the world you may be stuck in now is not the only world that's out there.
Did you want to add any of your own advice, Nikki?
It's not so much advice as in a way sort of reinforcing what Ianto has said. I once I kind of did something quite similar to Dimity in that I fell into marriage and children early on in my life and kind of was a bit of a failure at both of them and thought that the failure was mine until I somehow stumbled upon something called women's studies. And it gave me this conceptual vocabulary, I guess, for thinking about why it was that I was not able to do that. And like not fitting, not conforming. If you have a critical toolbox to help you understand that, then it doesn't, you can turn it around from being something that is a fault of yours to something else that is productive, I think.
Great answers, both of you. So we have a small question from Gabby, who says, how can we get rid of patriarchy living in a capitalist world?
Nikki, do you have a shot at that?
Well, just keep on, chipping away is the only answer I have. I don't know. If I knew, I'd be a rich woman. Well, maybe not rich, but happy.
I'm trying to think. I remember having this sort of conversation with my mother about, how do we live when the world is like this? And my mother was a great optimist, and she always used to have this sort of convoluted answer. She said, well, look at, things are bad. There are things that are getting worse. But look at, what's happened over kind of the long now rather than right now. Like if you'd been born 10 years earlier, you would have been adopted out. That if she'd been born 10 years earlier, she wouldn't have had a kidney transplant. She would have died. When my grandmother was born and was growing up, it was still, my grandmother, I think, was born in the days when people were still going out and shooting Aboriginal people. And even though we may look at Aboriginal rights and say we have a long way to go, we're no longer at a point where that kind of thing is being acceptable. Prior to that, it hasn't been that long since there was still legalized slavery operating out of the British Empire and through the US. When my ancestors first came to Ghana land in the 1830s, late 1838, they came from a country where they weren't allowed to vote. The ancestors I had who stayed in that country, most of them died in poorhouses. My Irish ancestors came to Australia because of the Great Famine. Most of their relatives died. I think 2 million people had to migrate. there's a lot of things that we have managed to change that, you know, they seemed insurmountable at the time. You know, I know it's hard when you're dealing with the constant deluge of homophobia and bigotry and racism, and but you know, these things are winning. You know, we are kind of, there are a lot of people who are still committed to these old-fashioned ideas of justice and a sense of community, and I think you just have to hold on to that idea. But there have been some really major victories, and we are still moving forward, even though at times it feels pretty miserable and terrible.
I think that's the import of history too, is it shows us that things do change. And I think what's so important about work like this book is that it helps us to think about that from the perspective of individuals, you know, personal lives. So each of us can contribute to change. It doesn't mean to say we're going to make it happen overnight, but we can each contribute in all of the ways that Dimity did and Ianto has, and this book, you know, continues that.
That's really a great response from both of you. We're nearly at time, so I might leave the last couple of questions and a comment, but we'll make sure we send them through to our panellists. We always do a follow-up email for anyone who has registered. So, and I don't think I gave Ianto the heads up about this, but Nikki would be aware of the drill that if you're willing to respond by email, Nikki and Ianto will forward any further discussion in written form to people who've registered tonight and in our general Talking History newsletter. It's been an amazing discussion. Thank you to both of you. Great product placement, Nikki. If you haven't already read Ianto's book, I think it's gone on a lot of people's lists tonight. So yeah, thank you both for sharing your thoughts. And it's a really wonderful topic that I think we could keep talking for a lot longer about, but we will try and finish up on time for once. The other thing I have to do before we go is say thank you. Karen jumped in at very short notice to help monitor things behind the scenes and try and troubleshoot if we had any technical issues. And Christy's always very effusive in her thanks of people doing that. So thank you to you too, Christy, for taking over that end of the reins when your voice gave out and we had to rearrange quickly. Nikki and Ianto, you have led it beautifully tonight and given us really a great deal of food for thought. So thank you for sharing both personal and political stories. And we've all really enjoyed it. Those of you who've signed up for this, we will send you the General Talking History newsletter with the update of when the recording is online and a link to that. So if you know anyone who's missed out and you think they'd enjoy it, feel free to share. We always have the information about the past Talking History and those coming up on our website, which is history.sa.gov.au for those of you who aren't regulars. And we have come to the end of the 2021 program. So stay tuned. I think sometime early in the new year, we will have a lineup up online for the 2022 Talking History. And it's likely to be, at this point, a mixture of online discussions like this one and special in-person experiences. So we're phasing out of that COVID world that we've all got used to. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and special thanks to Dr. Nikki Sullivan and Dr. Ianto Ware and all of the people behind the scenes. Thanks for joining us, and we'll hope you all have a wonderful break before the next line of talks begins.
Thank you.
Thanks.